Hey guys, welcome to AP Biology for our first lecture in biochemistry, Chemistry Basics 01. And this is Lola up on my shoulder. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. All right, so let's look at some of the elements. These are the most common elements that we see in all life forms. You know, you're familiar with a lot of them: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus. But you may not know that, sodium and chlorine, magnesium, they're pretty common in living organisms. Yes, they are. But look at oxygen. It makes up 65% of your weight. You might be going like, well, where's that all coming from? Well, remember, your body's about 75% water. And water is composed of a hydrogen and two oxygen atoms, and hydrogen is a very light atom. Oxygen is relatively heavy compared to hydrogen. And so I like to call it CHNOPS. Okay, this is an easy way to remember the common elements that are going to be found in not only in your body, but also in the four classes of biological macromolecules that we will be learning about this week: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And all four of those groups are made up of different combinations of these six elements that you see down here: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, or CHNOPS is an easy way to remember it. Okay. Excuse me. So one thing you might wonder is, first of all, where do the elements come from? Where do atoms come from? Well, we're gonna watch a short little video, and we're gonna put pause. I'm gonna pause the video here, and you're gonna watch a video, and you'll figure out where they do come from. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that short video there, and let me put this over here. So let's look a little bit at what an atom actually is. Okay, so first of all atoms have at least a proton in the center. Helium is the only atom that lacks neutron. Or excuse me, not helium. Hydrogen is the only atom that lacks a neutron. It consists simply of a proton and an electron. This right here is helium, which has two protons, two neutrons, and two electrons. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about these shells where we find everything. Protons have a positive charge. Neutrons, as the name sounds, have no charge. They are neutral. However, both protons and neutrons have the same weight as each other. Okay, they make up most of the atomic mass of an atom. Electrons are extremely small and weigh literally nothing compared to a proton or a neutron. Okay, and these electrons are constantly moving around the proton and neutron. We can never predict where they are. So this picture is showing you a cloud of negative charge that's being made just by two neutrons, because they could be anywhere at any point at any time because they are moving so fast. Okay, so this, you might have seen this model in 8th grade, or maybe you had chemistry already, the Bohr model, and we talk about these electron shells. And it's not really a correct model in terms of what's actually happening in real life, but it suits biology just fine. This simple model, and it suits most of chemistry just fine. So what we're looking at here is a nitrogen atom. And you might go, how do you know it's a nitrogen? Well, because it has 7 protons. You can count them up. We go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 protons. That makes it. Its atomic number is 7, and its atomic mass is close to 14 because it also has 7 neutrons, again, which protons and neutrons have the same weight. And then it's going to have 7 electrons. And now these electrons are going to fill their shells in different ways. The first shell is a very low energy shell, and it can only contain 2 electrons. The second shell can contain a max of 8 electrons. But how many are here? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we take our 5 here and our 2 right here. That's a total of 7 electrons. And that means that the outer shell here, which is called the valence electron shell, the outer shell is always called the valence shell, and the valence electrons are found in that outer shell. Those are the electrons that are going to react with other atoms and things. So very important to know what that valence shell is and how many electrons are in there. So they're the ones that are going to be reacting. And then also the number of electrons in that outer shell, that valence shell, give a element its properties. Is it reactive? Is it non-reactive? Is it more likely to gain electrons? Is it more likely to lose electrons? Is it more likely to form covalent bonds or ionic bonds? So those valence electrons really play an important role in the properties of a particular atom. Also, the position of the electrons. The electrons in the outer shell have more energy than the electrons in the inner shell. So an element can actually gain energy by the electrons absorbing energy and getting boosted to a higher energy shell. And when an element loses energy, when an atom loses energy, the electrons fall closer towards the nucleus. As you can see here in this particular diagram, we can boost electrons from the first shell to the second, and from the second to the third, or even from the first all the way out to the third, depending on how much energy is coming in. And this will play an important role when we talk about photosynthesis, where the element magnesium is playing a role in absorbing the energy that are found in photons of light. And that's how plants are able, and where's magnesium found is found in the center of a chlorophyll molecule, which I'm sure you have heard about. And those electrons get boosted to a higher energy state, and then those electrons actually get transferred to a protein, and we'll talk all about that when we get to Unit 3. It's pretty complicated stuff, but also pretty interesting. And again, it's the energy of position is what we call potential energy. All right, so where those electrons are, if they're close to the nucleus, low potential energy. If they're far away from the nucleus, they have high potential energy. Just like if you have a book resting on the ground, it has zero potential energy. However, if I bend over and I pick that book up and I raise it up over my head, it now has lots of potential energy. And if I just let it go, it would fall down very quickly, hit the floor, make a big bang, generate shock waves in the floor, generate levels of heat, and turning that energy of motion into other types of energy. Okay, so you might hear of molecules and elements and things. What are those? Well, molecules can be composed of the same element. This is an oxygen molecule, O2. And it is actually, these bars right here represent covalent bonds. What is a covalent bond? That's when two elements share electrons. Okay, they share electrons right here. So they're sharing those electrons. Covalent bonds are strong bonds. They're strong in water. They're strong when they're dry. They are difficult to break apart. It takes energy to make those bonds, and when those bonds are broken, it releases energy. So energy is stored in bonds. The carbon-hydrogen bond is a particularly strong bond. And when those bonds are broken, they give off a lot of energy. And if you think about this, gasoline and oil are all composed of carbon-hydrogen bonds. And when we break all those bonds simultaneously in your car's engine, they cause an explosion in the cylinder, which drives the piston, which then is going to turn the crankshaft, which then turns the drive shaft, which turns your wheels. Okay, so those bonds have a lot of energy in them. Wrong button here. Okay. A molecule, however, can also be made up of different elements. This is the molecule of water, of course. And, water consists of two hydrogens and an oxygen, right? What we have here, remember, hydrogen has one electron. Oxygen has actually 6 valence electrons, because oxygen's atomic number is 8, so it has 2 inner electrons and leaves 6 in its outer shell. Oxygen wants to have 8 electrons in the outer shell, and hydrogen wants to have 2 electrons in the outer shell. Oops, keep it's jumping ahead on me. All right. So hydrogen wants to have two electrons in its outer shell. So a water molecule is a very stable molecule because the valence electrons of both oxygen and hydrogen are filled with the total max number of electrons available that they can have. Two for the hydrogen and eight for the oxygen through the sharing of these electrons in these single covalent bonds. And as I said before, it's these valence electrons that really play a role. They give a molecule its properties. I'm just going to get rid of me. Okay, they give a molecule its basic properties. And when we look at this, all of the elements in column 1 all have one valence electrons. All of the elements in column 8 all have 8 valence electrons. And you might know those as the noble gases. Okay, they're unreactive. They don't react with anything. Whereas this column right here, there are 7 valence electrons. It's very reactive. It wants to steal, fluorine and chlorine want to steal electrons from some other molecule. Where does it steal it from? Generally from molecules in column 1. So you can make hydrogen chloride, HCl, which is hydrochloric acid. Okay, lithium chloride, which is a salt used in many medicines and things like that. And of course, table salt, sodium chloride. Sodium's going to lose an electron because it only has one in its valence electron shell, and chlorine's going to gain that electron. And that's going to give us some different properties of those. That's a different type of bond. So like I said earlier, covalent bonds result from the sharing of electrons. Carbon is a wonderful molecule for building complex molecules because it has 4 valence electrons. Therefore, it can make 4 covalent bonds. This is one of the simplest of hydrocarbons. This is methane. Okay, it's one of the simplest hydrocarbons, CH4. That's how I would write that as a formula, CH4, CH lower or subscript 4. Okay, and that is methane. And again, remember, hydrogen has 1 valence electron, and carbon has 4 valence electrons because carbon's atomic number is 6, so it has 2 on the inner shell and 4 in the outer shell. But when it shares with 4 other hydrogens, it now has 8. Okay, so you're going to hear this word a lot. This is really super important. We're going to do a lab on water on Tuesday. Okay, this thing called a polar molecule. Now, I said earlier that water is it has covalent bonds with hydrogen. It shares electrons with hydrogen, but because oxygen is a very special molecule, it has what we call a very super high electronegativity value. And you're going, what the heck does that mean? Electronegativity value basically says that it wants to hog the electrons, so to speak. Oxygen loves electrons. So remember, all these electrons are zooming around in clouds around the protons of oxygen and hydrogen, okay, around the nucleuses of them. But because oxygen has such a strong pull of electrons towards its towards its nucleus, those electrons on average are going to spend more time, the hydrogen's electrons on average are going to spend more time around the oxygen side, and therefore less time around the hydrogen side. So overall, water has a neutral charge, but because the electrons spend more time around the oxygen end of this molecule is slightly negative, and that's what this funny little symbol up here means. It's slightly negative, and because the electrons spend less time around the hydrogen ends are slightly positive. This molecule is polar. Okay, it has a slight charge on the negative charge on the oxygen end and a slight positive charge on the hydrogen end. And this is extremely important. This is what gives water all of its amazing properties, and water has a lot of amazing properties. So, as I say up here, James Bond. I hope any of you guys are Bond fans. A non-polar covalent bond is when the electrons are shared equally between 2 atoms. Okay, there's no charges on either end. A polar covalent bond is when the electrons are spending more time around one of the atoms than the other. In this case, we see chlorine is attracting the electrons more than the hydrogen. An ionic bond is something different. That's when there's a complete transfer of electrons from one atom to another. In this case, if you remember, sodium only has one valence electron. Chlorine has 7 valence electrons, and chlorine is neutral with 7 valence electrons. However, when chlorine and sodium are near each other, chlorine is going to steal one of the electrons from sodium. Okay, and sodium wants to give that electron up. And when it does that, sodium, which was neutral with its electron, now becomes positive, and chlorine, when it gains an electron, now becomes negative, and that forms what we call an ionic bond. There's an attraction between positive and negative. They don't share any electrons. One is stolen electrons. They're just attracted to each other because of opposite charges. Then this word ion. Ions are extremely important in biology, and all an ion is an atom with a charge. So sodium is neutral, and it's called a sodium atom. It has its full number of electrons. There's that single valence electrons. It loses the outer electron. It now becomes charged. It becomes positive because it lost that negative charge. It is now known as a sodium ion. Chlorine atoms have 2 electrons, 8 electrons, and 7 electrons in the valence shell. However, when it gains a electron from sodium, let's say, then it becomes negative, and it goes from a chlorine atom to a chlorine ion. And ions play an incredible role in the movement of water, in the transmission of nerve impulses. They play such a huge role in biology. We need to know what those are. And the important ones that we really need to know about are sodium, chlorine, potassium, phosphorus, potassium, protons, which are basically a single hydrogen proton. We'll get there in a second. A really important role. Okay, and there is the formation of a ionic bond. We take sodium loses its electron, chlorine gains it. One becomes positive, one becomes negative. They are attracted to each other, and that's what we call an ionic bond. That's what salt is. Okay, and ionic bonds are very strong and stable as long as they remain dry. As soon as you put a ionic compound into water, which ionic compounds are generally salts, then they are going to disassociate. Water is going to rip those suckers apart. Okay, because of water's polarity. The proton, extremely important in biology. Okay, there's a carbon atom, has 6 protons and 6 neutrons and 6 electrons. There's a hydrogen atom. Notice the hydrogen atom lacks a neutron. It has 1 proton and 1 electron. So when a hydrogen atom loses its electron, the only thing that's left is a proton. And we're going to talk about protons a lot, especially in the generation of energy in something called the electron transport chain when we get to Unit 3. And we have proton pumps. Proton pumps are found in your nervous system. Proton pumps are found in your mitochondria. Proton pumps are found in your stomach. They're all over the place. Okay? And they play a huge role, like I said, in biology, and we need to understand exactly what a proton is. Okay, and all a proton is a hydrogen atom that has lost its electron. Okay, protons, the concentration of protons also make up, or the, I should say, is a property of the pH scale. If you have a high concentration of protons, then you have acids. When protons and something called a hydroxyl atom, what's a hydroxyl? Well, if you take water, okay, water's H2O, and you break it apart, it's going to break apart into a proton, a hydrogen just a hydrogen, and it's also going to break apart into an OH group, what's called a hydroxyl. OH, oxygen and a hydrogen. Well, a proton has a positive charge, and hydroxyls have a negative charge, and that's what water is. Okay, and pure water has an equal concentration of protons and hydroxyl ions, and therefore it has a neutral charge. But as soon as you start increasing the proton concentration, then you start becoming acidic. So, as you say, your saliva has a pH of about 6. It's 10 times more acidic than pure water. It has 10 times the proton concentration. Black coffee has a pH of 5. It's 10 times greater than a pH of 6, or 100 times greater than pure water in terms of proton concentration. Coca-Cola has a pH of 3. That's going to be 10 times 10 times 10. That's going to be times 10. That's 10,000 times greater proton concentration than pure water. Stomach acid, 1,000,000 times. Battery acid, 10 million times as acidic, a pH of 0. It's all about the proton concentration. Okay, so one of the most important bonds, besides covalent bonds and ionic bonds, is something we call a hydrogen bond. Okay, a hydrogen bond is simply an attraction. It's kind of like an ionic bond in a way, but it's a very weak ionic bond, and they form in water. Okay, ionic bonds don't form in water. Ionic bonds only form when when salts are dry, not in water. Okay, so here's a water molecule. And remember, the hydrogens have a slight positive charge. Here's an ammonia molecule, which is also a polar molecule. Okay, in this case, the nitrogen is pulling the electrons towards itself, so it is slightly negative. The hydrogen is slightly positive, and this very, very, very weak bond is formed between these two. It's an association. It's a bond that can break and be broken very, very, very quickly. When we do our lab on Tuesday, we're going to talk a lot about hydrogen bonds and that are formed by water molecules, between water molecules, and between water molecules and something else. Again, they're constantly being made, they're constantly being broken, and this is what gives water many of its properties, such as adhesion, cohesion, its ability to work as a solvent, its ability to be less dense when a solid, which is a really unusual thing, than when it's liquid. And it gives water its high heat retention. It's very difficult to change the temperature of water. You have to apply a lot of energy because you have to break a lot of these bonds. Okay, so again, we'll be talking about hydrogen bonds quite a bit in this unit, so make sure you understand what those are. The last thing I want to talk about are van der Waals interactions. These are very weak charges that happen between just something that has a slight negative charge, and potentially, in what we see here in this particular incidence, is that we get attraction between these atoms when there's different charges between them. It's not an ionic bond. It's not a hydrogen bond. It's just between the different polarities of these different molecules. It's super, super weak, but if you have a whole bunch of them, they can be actually quite strong. And if you ever watch geckos, that's what allows geckos to climb up glass. And if you zoom in on geckos' feet, basically it's about surface area. And their toes are completely divided up into these small little like hairs, and there's all these slight static charges on these hairs that allow them to basically stick to things. Anyways, that's our our lecture on basic chemistry. Make sure you look over that in your 5 Steps to a 5 guide, or in chapter 2 in your textbook, which you'll get this week. So, or look at the student notes that you have access to right now. Hope that helps.